Sam here. In this video I want to focus on cutting smaller parts with my sliding table saw. Lots of them. Using both my crosscut fences and my incremental positioner. As you may have seen in other videos, I normally use this positioner as a parallel cutting device for longer stock, in conjunction with my flip stops to create 2 points in space that are equidistant from the slider's edge. I have attached a small fence extrusion to it so that it can be used alone as well for smaller pieces. Here you can see that I mount the whole assembly to my supplemental support table using an adjustable reference block at the back so that every time I take it on and off I can rest assured that it comes back parallel to the slider's edge. The 1-inch thick block you see is for when I want to use it as a single point in space, and the 1-inch burn makes the math easy when switching back and forth without having to move the tape measure each time, the one that is under the cursor you see here. Here you see me using it as a point in space, in tandem with stops on my miter gauge for medium length pieces. Now the positioner by itself. Instead of pushing the piece against a fixed fence, the fence is fixed and the piece moves with it. Through the course of many jobs, no matter how carefully I try to minimize my waste, it still happens. It piles up and piles up. Wall space, shelf space, buckets and boxes. And I can't bring myself to throw any of it out. It's a sickness, some say, maybe so. Woodworking does strange things to a man. And there are only so many pens you can turn to go through this stuff. Every so often I try to incorporate my waste into a project. I call them my off-cut works. Often some sort of mosaic. This one is for a project for a library room. Maybe someday I'll post some pictures of such works, and for now you can just watch me making boatloads of pieces for it. See here, I'm picking from my junk piles, straightening edges, some ripping, some squaring, riffing if you will, making pieces I can work with to make my tile pieces. next up calls for cross-cutting. Here you can see I use the slider's original miter gauge platform as a base for the Incra 3000 miter gauge system. I like this miter gauge because it will dial in nicely to the nearest half degree between 0 and 90 degrees in either direction. I used the same type of fence extrusion that you saw on the parallel positional earlier too. Supplied by one fence, I have these extrusions on most of my machines, so flip stops, jigs, and platforms can be borrowed and used everywhere else in the shop too. Here you see two extrusions coupled together to make one long fence on my drill press. The first type of repetitive cross-cutting you will see is using this miter gauge in push cutting mode. In other words, the fence is between you and the piece, probably the type of cross-cutting most folks are accustomed to. You see that piece of black laminate taped around the blade and along the length of the slider's edge? Well, all sliders are set above their cast iron work surfaces for safety and ease of cutting reasons. This can cause some issues with smaller pieces though, whether ripping or cross-cutting. I solve this dilemma by adjusting my slider to be exactly 1 Formica sheet thickness above the cast iron work surface. So when I want a continuously level surface, I can achieve it by taping these strips down. Here's another example with a Dado blade, creating a long wide groove. You see that the laminate strip keeps the piece level throughout. This type of repetitive cross-cutting is fast and efficient, but eventually the pieces get small enough that you can no longer register enough of the fence to safely cut anymore. So now I have waste of my waste piling up, but I will deal with those new junk piles a little bit later. Here you can see the same type of cross-cutting, but with a twist. I'm thrust cutting rather than push cutting like before. The piece is now between me and the fence. I usually prefer this type of cutting because I am the clamp, keeping the pressure on the piece through the fence in the same direction as the cut, rather than having to pull the piece into the fence while I push to make the cut. You especially notice the advantages of thrust cutting when the pieces get wider than 12 inches, making your reach to pull them into the push cutting fence less than comfortable. Here's the rig I made to deal with really small pieces. It's simply a push block I borrowed from my shaper, but that's another video. Here, I modified it by removing the handle and adding the slots so that it can be fixed to the slider. Now I have 2 jigs in one. In this case, it works with my positioner for setting the dimension I want, while quickly allowing me to keep the rig's edge parallel to the slider's edge. I use a slotted piece of wood as a simple clamp to keep the small pieces securely held in the rig. And if the pieces are small enough, I can cut 2 or 3 at a time. I mean, most of us think of parallel cutting as a form of ripping, but as you can see here, we are making parallel cuts across the grain. This rig doesn't care which I do. Well, the junk pile has diminished some, and this box is nearly full of rebirth and future usefulness. I sure hope you got something useful from this too. Bye-bye for now.